A Tale of Two Cities. The story begins in the year 1775. It was a time of great change in England and France. The people were poor, and the governments were cruel. In England, crime was everywhere. In France, the poor were starving, and the rich were living in luxury. It was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. The story starts in a small town in England. A man named Mr. Jarvis Lorry was traveling to Paris. He worked for a bank called Tellson's Bank. He was carrying an important message. The message was for a man named Dr. Manette. Dr. Manette had been in prison in France for 18 years. He had just been released, and Mr. Lorry was going to bring him back to England. Mr. Lorry met a young woman named Lucy Manette in Dover. Lucy was Dr. Manette's daughter. She thought her father was dead. Mr. Lorry told her the truth. He said, "Your father is alive. He has been in prison for 18 years. We are going to bring him back to England." Lucy was shocked. She did not know what to say. She had never met her father. She was scared but also excited. She wanted to see him. Mr. Lorry and Lucy traveled to Paris. They went to a small house where Dr. Manette was staying. The house was dark and dirty. Dr. Manette was sitting in a corner, making shoes. He did not recognize Lucy. He did not even know his own name. He had been in prison for so long that he had lost his mind. Lucy was heartbroken. She wanted to help her father. She talked to him softly and held his hand. Slowly, Dr. Manette began to remember. He looked at Lucy and said, "You are my daughter." Lucy cried and hugged him. Mr. Lorry and Lucy took Dr. Manette back to England. They brought him to a small house in London. Lucy took care of her father. She helped him recover. Slowly, Dr. Manette became better. He started to remember his past. He started to live again. 5 years passed. Dr. Manette was much better. He and Lucy lived a quiet life in London. They were happy. One day, a man named Charles Darnay came to visit them. Charles was a Frenchman, but he lived in England. He was kind and polite. Lucy liked him very much. Charles Darnay was not his real name. His real name was Charles Evermond. He came from a rich and powerful family in France. But he did not like his family. They were cruel and selfish. He had left France and changed his name to start a new life in England. Charles and Lucy fell in love. They wanted to get married. But Charles had a secret. He was afraid to tell Lucy and Dr. Manette about his past. He was afraid they would not accept him. Meanwhile, in France, the poor people were getting angry. They were tired of being hungry and poor. They were tired of the rich people's cruelty. They wanted change. They wanted a revolution. In London, Charles Darnay was put on trial. He was accused of being a spy. The trial was in a court called the Old Bailey. The witnesses said they had seen Charles giving information to the French. But Charles said he was innocent. A man named Sidney Carton was also in the court. He was a lawyer, but he was not very successful. He was often drunk and did not care about his work. But he was very smart. He noticed something strange about the witnesses. He realized they were lying. Sidney Carton stood up and said, "The witnesses are lying. They are mistaken. This man is not the spy." The judge listened to Sidney and agreed. Charles Darnay was set free. After the trial, Sidney Carton met Charles and Lucy. He apologized for his behavior. He said, "I am sorry for being rude. I am not a good person, but I want to help you." Charles and Lucy forgave Sidney. They became friends. Sidney often visited their house. He liked Lucy very much, but he knew she loved Charles. He did not want to ruin their happiness. One day, Charles told Lucy and Dr. Manette the truth about his past. He said, "My real name is Charles Evermond. I come from a rich family in France. But I left because I did not like their cruelty. I changed my name to start a new life." Lucy and Dr. Manette were surprised, but they forgave Charles. They loved him and wanted to be with him. Charles and Lucy got married. They were very happy. Meanwhile, in France, the revolution began. The poor people rose up against the rich. They attacked the palaces and killed the nobles. The streets were filled with blood. The revolution was violent and cruel. Charles Darnay received a letter from France. The letter said that his old servant, Gabelle, was in prison. Gabelle had been arrested because he worked for the Evermond family. Charles felt guilty. He wanted to help Gabelle. He decided to go back to France. Charles said goodbye to Lucy and Dr. Manette. He promised to return soon. He traveled to Paris, but it was dangerous. The revolutionaries were killing anyone who was connected to the nobles. Charles was arrested as soon as he arrived in Paris. He was put in prison and accused of being a traitor. Lucy and Dr. Manette were worried. They did not know what to do. They decided to go to Paris to help Charles. They took Sidney Carton with them. Sidney wanted to help his friends. When they arrived in Paris, they found that Charles was in a prison called La Force. The prison was dark and dirty. The prisoners were treated badly. Lucy and Dr. Manette tried to visit Charles, but they were not allowed. They were desperate. Dr. Manette had an idea. He was a famous doctor. He had helped many people during the revolution. He went to the leaders of the revolution and said, "I am Dr. Manette. I helped the poor. I want to help my son-in-law. He is not a traitor. Please, let him go." The leaders listened to Dr. Manette. They respected him. They agreed to let Charles go. Charles was released from prison. He was happy to see Lucy and Dr. Manette. They thought everything was going to be okay. But the revolution was not over. The leaders of the revolution were cruel and unpredictable. They could change their minds at any moment. Charles was not safe in Paris. He had to leave as soon as possible. Charles Darnay was free, but he was not safe. The revolutionaries in Paris were unpredictable. They could arrest him again at any moment. Lucy, Dr. Manette, and Sidney Carton knew they had to act quickly. They needed to get Charles out of France before it was too late. Dr. Manette used his influence to get travel papers for Charles. He hoped they could leave Paris quietly. But the revolutionaries were watching them closely. They did not trust anyone who had connections to the nobility. Charles's past as an Evremond made him a target. One night, as they were preparing to leave, Charles was arrested again. This time, the charges were more serious. The revolutionaries accused him of being an enemy of the people. They said he had betrayed the revolution. Charles was taken to a prison called La Conciergerie. It was a place where prisoners waited for their trials, and often, their executions. Lucy was devastated. She could not lose Charles. She went to the prison every day, hoping to see him. She stood outside the gates, crying and praying for his safety. Dr. Manette tried to use his influence again, but this time, it did not work. The revolutionaries were too powerful. Sidney Carton watched Lucy suffer. He loved her deeply, even though he knew she loved Charles. He wanted to help her. He wanted to save Charles, not just for Lucy, but because he believed it was the right thing to do. Sidney was not a hero. He was a man who had wasted much of his life. But he wanted to do something meaningful now. Sidney came up with a plan. He knew it was dangerous, but he was willing to take the risk. He went to a man named John Barsad, who worked as a spy for the revolutionaries. Sidney knew Barsad from the trial in London. Barsad had been one of the witnesses who lied about Charles. Sidney threatened to expose Barsad's secrets unless he helped him. Barsad agreed to help. He gave Sidney a plan to get into the prison. Sidney also met a young woman named Miss Pross, who worked as Lucy's maid. Miss Pross was brave and loyal. She wanted to help save Charles too. The day of Charles's trial arrived. The courtroom was crowded with angry people. They wanted to see Charles punished. The judge asked Charles if he was guilty. Charles said, "No, I am not guilty. I have done nothing wrong." But the revolutionaries did not care about the truth. They wanted revenge. They found Charles guilty and sentenced him to death. He was to be executed by the guillotine the next day. Lucy was heartbroken. She could not believe this was happening. Dr. Manette tried to comfort her, but he was also in despair. They had no more options. Or so they thought. That night, Sidney Carton put his plan into action. He went to the prison with Barsad's help. He bribed the guards and got inside. He found Charles in his cell. Charles was surprised to see him. Sidney said, "There is no time to explain. You must trust me." Sidney gave Charles his clothes and told him to change. Then Sidney took Charles's place in the cell. Charles did not understand, but he trusted Sidney. He put on Sidney's clothes and left the prison with Barsad's help. The next morning, the guards came to take Charles to the guillotine. But they did not know it was Sidney in the cell. Sidney looked very similar to Charles. The guards did not notice the difference. They took Sidney to the execution site. Lucy, Dr. Manette, and Charles were already on their way out of Paris. They did not know what Sidney had done. They only knew that he had helped them escape. They were grateful, but they were also worried about him. At the guillotine, Sidney stood bravely. He was not afraid. He knew he was doing the right thing. He thought about Lucy and how much he loved her. He thought about Charles and how he had saved him. He thought about the words from the Bible, "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known." Sidney's sacrifice saved Charles's life. Charles, Lucy, and Dr. Manette escaped to England. They were safe, but they were also sad. They knew what Sidney had done for them. They would never forget him. Back in Paris, the revolution continued. The streets were filled with violence and blood. The revolutionaries turned on each other. The leaders who had sentenced Charles to death were themselves executed. The revolution consumed everything in its path. In England, Charles and Lucy started a new life. They had a family and lived peacefully. They often thought about Sidney and his sacrifice. They named their son after him. They wanted to honor his memory. Dr. Manette lived with them. He was happy to see his daughter and her family safe. He often told stories about the past, but he never forgot the horrors of the revolution. He knew how lucky they were to have escaped. Sidney Carton's sacrifice was not in vain. He had given his life for the people he loved. He had found meaning in his final act. He had become a hero.